I was reading through some old archives recently and came across this curious trend from the 1700s that feels almost like a fever dream by today's standards.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about, the Parisian salons.
Exactly. Imagine a Parisian salon where the most popular book isn't some dry philosophical treatise, but a wild Oriental tale about, a Babylonian philosopher or an Ethiopian prince.
Right. And authors like Voltaire and Samuel Johnson weren't just writing stories. They were doing something much more complex.
They were performing this kind of intellectual shape-shifting. They take their own European anxieties, mix them with these speculative guesses about the East, and create these strange hybrid characters.
And these characters were essentially crossbreeds, fusions of European and non-European minds.
That's the perfect way to put it. And what's so fascinating is how they treated the other. It wasn't like a static object to be studied under a microscope. There was this giddy, experimental openness.
It was a time when those rigid walls we take for granted today, between Christian and pagan or between different races, they just hadn't hardened yet.
Right. So for these writers, stepping into a culturally different mind was a kind of playful mental exercise, a way to reform themselves by imagining they were someone else entirely.
In a way, it was the original speculative realism, a bit like how a modern sci-fi writer might try to inhabit the mind of an AI.
Totally. But then as we move into the 19th century, that whole mood just vanishes. That fluid, chaotic exchange is gone.
And it's replaced by a cold, hard separation. The East becomes this fixed, transparent target for colonial study.
We think of the Enlightenment as all strict, dry reason, but when you look at these tales, you realize it was actually the last time the West was truly comfortable not knowing exactly where it ended and the rest of the world began. It really makes you wonder, in our rush to define every identity today, have we lost that shape-shifting ability that made the culture so vibrant?
Well, that phenomenon, that intellectual shape-shifting, that ability to willingly adopt a foreign perspective for self-critique is precisely the focus of our deep dive today.
So we're digging into the sources behind that.
We are, and what they reveal is a history of intellectual exchange between East and West that is, frankly, far richer and more nuanced than the common narrative of some fixed, inevitable separation.
So our mission here is to trace that legacy, to show how the 18th century was really defined by this transcultural exchange and mutual respect.
Exactly. We're challenging the idea that the West was just, projecting its fantasies onto the East.
It sounds like there was a genuine search for a shared human experience, even when they were using these, quote, Oriental settings.
Absolutely. We're looking at an era defined by a dialogic and negotiating tendency. The writers of this period were not trying to establish a radical distinction between cultures.
Okay, so what were they trying to do?
They were focused on establishing commensurability. And when we talk about commensurability in this context, we mean the capacity for equal comparison, finding common ground, shared values, and, even parallel flaws.
So they saw places like the Ottoman Orient, Persia, and China, not as these totally alien worlds, but as
complex, knowable realities. Realities that allowed them to look at both the East and the West from a more critical, informed, and frankly, liberal perspective. That inquisitive spirit of the Enlightenment was truly interanimating European and Oriental cultures.
Interanimating, I like that. They were using each other to understand universal human truths.
That's it.
That concept of commensurability, of equal comparison, is really key. But if you're going to compare cultures like that, you need a mechanism, right? A way to deliver that critique without facing immediate rejection or, worse, censorship from your home audience. Which brings us directly to the foundational genre of this whole movement, the Pseudo-Oriental Letter and the power of what you call the foreign mask. Why did that literary strategy become so essential?
The foreign mask was, it was a brilliant literary and political maneuver. By placing an outsider, often a Turk, a Persian, and later a Chinese philosopher right in the middle of European society, authors could hold a mirror up to their own social and political systems.
Because the outsider's gaze is detached?
Exactly. It's inherently detached, cosmopolitan, and critical. And this detachment suggested a fundamental truth: that the human world was expansive, that it consisted of diversity, and that no single European norm was absolute. It provided a critical narrative from a safe external vantage point.
Which would help you get around the censors.
It mitigated the threat of direct political censure, absolutely.
And the earliest example that really cemented this trend was Giovanni Paolo Morana's Turkish Spy, which came out in 1684. What made Mahmut, the Turkish spy, such an effective character for, as you say, smuggling the truth?
Marana's Mahmud was this shadowy, intriguing figure. He's supposedly reporting back to the divan in Constantinople while living secretly in Paris. The whole act of hiding his identity provided the perfect cover.
Okay, so he's undercover.
He is, and this allows him to denounce the follies and, the deep corruptions of contemporary French society without the author, Marana, facing imprisonment or censure for sedition. The pretense of a Turkish origin granted an immunity that a native French writer would never have.
Can you give us a concrete example of Mahmud's critique? I mean, what specific French customs, things Europeans thought were normal, did he see as just absurd?
Well, his observations were incredibly sharp. He focused on the self-destructive nature of European customs. The most famous target was the aristocratic practice of dueling. Mahmud found it utterly ridiculous that Christian gentlemen who are supposedly bound by religious and civil laws would risk their lives over trivial slights, cutting one another's throats, oftentimes on slight occasion.
He's pointing out the hypocrisy.
Deep hypocrisy. He highlights how Europeans called Turks barbarians, yet they engage in this formalized self-slaughter, which was both illogical and religiously forbidden for them. The critique wasn't just about manners, it exposed a fundamental logical flaw in their whole honor system.
And what about politically?
Politically, he saw European conflicts with chilling clarity. Mahmud frequently pointed out the irony of Christian princes constantly warring amongst themselves. He notes that their divisions and constant strife only served to strengthen the Ottoman Empire.
Which could then just capitalize on a fragmented Europe.
Precisely. Mahmud specifically contrasted the instability he found in Paris, the political intrigue, the social hypocrisy, with what he called the great tranquility of Constantinople.
Now, was that necessarily a factual representation of Constantinople?
Probably not, but it was a rhetorical tool. By presenting the Orient as a place of stability and reason, he could effectively undermine European complacency.
It's a brilliant strategy.
Yeah.
And if Marana introduced it, it seems like Montesquieu, with his Persian letters in 1721, is the one who turned it into an intellectual phenomenon.
Oh, Persian letters was a publishing sensation. It absolutely cemented the genre's popularity. But Montesquieu's approach was different, and I think maybe more daring than Marana's.
How so?
His Persian observers, Uzbek and Ruka, they did not conceal their identities. They openly declared their Persian origins and, crucially, walked through the streets of Paris wearing their native clothes. They became an instant spectacle.
So they were active participants in the critique just by being visible. What was the Parisian reaction like?
Uzbek writes letters back home describing the sheer commotion they caused. He talks about how people would gather in these large circles around him in the Tuileries gardens, just staring, treating him as though he had been sent from heaven.
Wow.
Initially, the Parisians viewed them as this fascinating, exotic novelty, but Montesquieu uses this public display as part of his critical framework. The Persians' difference forces the French audience to confront their own customs, their own standards, just by the act of observing the observers. It turns the entire city into a stage.
What I find so interesting is the dual nature of Montesquieu's critique. He's critiquing Paris through Uzbek's eyes, but he's also critiquing Uzbek's own Persian background. So how did he manage to attack the French king's despotism without getting thrown in jail?
He used a brilliant structural device, contrast. And it was primarily focused on the Persian seraglio.
The seraglio.
Yes. The highly regulated domestic space where multiple wives and women were oppressed, controlled, denied freedom under men's absolute laws. It serves as a metaphor for institutionalized tyranny.
So by talking about the seraglio.
By detailing the complicated intrigues, the rivalries, the eventual self-destruction within the seraglio, Montesquieu was able to mask his direct attacks on the despotism of the French king, Louis XIV. The discussion of foreign Eastern tyranny gave him license to talk about his own government's tyrannical tendencies.
Okay, so if the seraglio represents this absolute institutionalized control, how did Uzbek and Rika view the social freedoms of Parisian women? It sounded like they would have been deeply confused.
They were profoundly disoriented. Their cultural distance provided this powerful double-edged sword for critique. Yes, they could criticize Persian oppression, but they were also aghast at what they saw as the corruptive freedom of Parisian women.
What did they find so corrupting?
Well, Rika, for example, critiques the frantic pace of Parisian life. He notes that women change fashions so rapidly that they fail to keep track of their own clothes. He observes that in Paris, marriages are purely economic transactions, and infidelity is so common that women essentially live under this shameful, corruptive freedom.
So Montesquieu is using their shock to suggest that both cultures are flawed, just in different ways.
Exactly. While Persia suffers from institutionalized violence and denial of individuality, France suffers from a moral and social corruption that comes from an excessive, ill-regulated freedom. Both cultures, in their own ways, are deeply corrupted.
Which highlights that the goal here wasn't just satire, it was a productive exchange of ideas. And this brings us to a complex term from literary theory you mentioned earlier, negotiation. If we accept that this exchange was mutually profitable, how do we define that negotiation in simple terms? What was the currency being exchanged?
The term negotiation, which we borrow from new historical literary theory, is key because it moves beyond simpler concepts like, mimesis or allegory. It describes the critical cultural change that is facilitated by literature.
And the currency.
The currency being exchanged is the systemic symbolization that enables a mutually profitable exchange between the creator, the society, and the work of art. The author gets a vehicle for radical social critique, society is forced into self-reflection, and the Orient gains intellectual legitimacy as a source of wisdom, or at least as a valid comparative framework.
That's a bit abstract, but it perfectly explains that shift from just imitating the Orient to actually integrating its perspective. Can we see this intellectual negotiation happening in the physical world outside of just books?
Absolutely. The clearest, most potent, real-world example of cultural negotiation leading to systematic social change is the introduction and eventual triumph of Turkish coffee houses in England during the late 17th century.
Coffee. So it was a Turkish import, a literal commodity that quickly became an intellectual one.
Precisely. When Turkish coffee was introduced by merchants, it was heralded as a Turkish novelty. The coffee house itself transformed the social imagination of London. It actually replaced the raucous stage of the Renaissance theater as the primary public sphere for intellectual exchange.
So these were places where people gathered to discuss politics, philosophy.
All of it. They would read periodicals like The Spectator and generally view the world from a more liberal, less class-bound perspective than they could in a tavern. This physical space fostered the exact kind of critical engagement the pseudo-letters promoted.
But I imagine that negotiation wasn't smooth. I remember reading there was intense social and political resistance to this Turkish novelty.
Oh, significant resistance, yes.
Right.
The negotiation involved serious controversy and pushback. The introduction of this dark, stimulating foreign drink and the novel social space it created was seen as threatening to establish English customs.
How?
Pamphlets emerged, intensely criticizing the phenomenon. Some women even issued a women's petition against coffee, claiming that this unhappy berry and Turkish enchantment endangered the English race by rendering their men effeminate.
Effeminate?
Turning them into gossipers and invalids, apparently.
It sounds like a precursor to every cultural anxiety about a new trend.
And politically, coffee houses were viewed with suspicion. They were claimed to be common assemblies that nurse the idleness and pragmaticalism, insinuating they harbored seditious prejudice against the government. King Charles II himself, recognizing their potential as revolutionary breeding grounds, issued a royal proclamation in 1675 to suppress them.
But the resistance failed.
It failed. The concept of the coffee house and the intellectual freedom it represented had just coalesced too strongly with the social needs of a rapidly expanding mercantile and intellectual class. The negotiation ultimately succeeded, producing a poetics of culture that was irrevocably altered by a Turkish import.
That transition is remarkable. Now let's move from that direct, masked critique to the realm of philosophical inquiry through the Oriental tale. The focus seems to shift from the city of Paris to the human condition itself.
Indeed. We move away from the direct satire of specific European customs and toward, more existential questions. This shift was heavily influenced by Antoine Galland's celebrated translation of the Arabian Nights, which provided a foundational model for spiritual, moral, and often satirical narratives.
So the exotic setting becomes a backdrop for these universal human truths.
That's right. Morality and the fundamental mysteries of human existence.
And the definitive English example here is Samuel Johnson's Rasselas, set in Abyssinia and Egypt. Johnson used this Oriental setting to conduct his deep philosophical inquiry into the vanity of human wishes, a theme he wrestled with his whole life.
Rasselas is a masterpiece of Enlightenment philosophical exploration. The central paradox is the so-called Happy Valley, where Prince Rasselas is raised. The valley is this highly controlled environment where every physical need is met and hardship is non-existent.
But that manufactured perfection fails to satisfy him. Why does total ease lead to unhappiness for Rasselas?
Because a life devoid of struggle, of conscious choice, and of knowledge of the outside world is profoundly restrictive. Rasselas realizes that a life where all desires are instantly gratified is more like an animal life than a human one.
So he feels a kind of spiritual boredom.
A deep spiritual ennui, a profound dissatisfaction with perfection. And this paradox immediately justifies his curiosity and sets the stage for the narrative's journey.
So that inquisitive spirit drives him out. Rasselas, his sister Nikaya, and the wise Imlach, they embark on a journey into Egypt, which was very much part of the Ottoman Orient, specifically to test their abstract philosophical concepts against concrete lived experience.
Yes, their journey is framed as the necessary pathway for the regulation of life, the reconciliation of thought and experience. Johnson believed that abstract understanding alone, philosophical theory in isolation, could never solve moral problems or determine true happiness.
So they have to observe actual human life.
They must. They visit the rich, the poor, the hermits, the scholars, the shepherds, the courts, all to try and find one instance of stable, unalloyed happiness.
Imlach, the philosopher-poet, seems like the crucial figure in this quest. He feels like the embodiment of this idea of intellectual shape-shifting, reconciling Eastern wisdom with Western thought.
Imlach is the ultimate reconciler. He serves as Rasselas' intellectual and spiritual guide, and his backstory is vital. He has traveled extensively from India and Africa to Europe. He learned that only a poet, by understanding and inhabiting all modes of life, could truly possess the comprehensive knowledge necessary for wisdom.
So he finds truth in the study of nature and man, not just in books.
Exactly. He holds a very balanced view of the world. He's the voice of 18th-century Enlightenment neoclassicism, but filtered through a cosmopolitan lens. He acknowledges the immense ancient Oriental influence on the progress of civilization.
Tracing knowledge back to the East.
Right. But at the same time, he freely admires the scientific, military, and artistic progress achieved by Western nations. His extensive Eastern wisdom serves as the necessary foundation for his poetical skills and philosophical balance.
And beyond the personal philosophical quest, the narrative also uses the setting to critique the governance structures they observe.
Right. That critique is sharpest when they arrive in Cairo. They observe the inherent dangers and instability that result from the Bassa of Egypt's despotic rule.
And Johnson gives a specific example of this.
He does. The powerful example of the wealthy man whose success became his greatest liability. This man, through hard work and fortune, accumulated vast prosperity, but his very wealth jeopardized his life, forcing him to flee Cairo for fear that the tyrannical Bassa would simply confiscate all his assets.
That's a profound observation, that in a truly despotic system, the greatest threat to a citizen is their own success.
It fundamentally undermines the concept of a stable social order. Johnson uses this to imply that the present Orient, governed by arbitrary tyranny, is suffering. And this modern corruption is then intentionally contrasted with the magnificent past they encounter.
The pyramids.
The achievements of the ancient Egyptians, particularly the pyramids, which Imlach views as the second greatest work of man. So the Orient is presented not as a single thing, but as a site of glorious past wisdom, contrasted with an unfortunate modern political decline.
Okay, so if Rasselas is the philosophical moral tale, then William Beckford's Vathek, written just a few decades later, takes the Oriental tale into a realm of pure, researched exoticism and dark fantasy. It feels much less concerned with English philosophical anxieties and more obsessed with the East itself.
Vathek is indeed a highly researched, hyper-exotic contrast. It dives deep into the medieval Islamic Orient. The protagonist, Caliph Vathek, is a figure of immense ambition and impiety, an Oriental Faustus.
So he's pursuing forbidden knowledge.
Exactly. His insatiable curiosity and relentless pursuit of immortal knowledge and power leads him to abjure Prophet Muhammad and descend into the Hall of Iblis, the Islamic version of hell.
So how does Beckford achieve that sense of exoticism? Does he maintain that intellectual shapeshifting, or is he just indulging in fantasy?
He maintains it, but through a lens of immense scholarly detail. What distinguishes Vathek is the sheer volume of actual Oriental references Beckford deployed. This wasn't guesswork. It was the result of extensive reading. He included historical figures like Harun al-Rashid, religious motifs like the angels of the grave, Munkar and Nakir.
Munkar and Nakir. Tell me more about that. How did including specific details like that heighten the sense of authenticity?
Munkar and Nakir are figures deeply embedded in Islamic eschatology. They're the angels who interrogate the deceased in their graves right after burial. By using such specific, well-known Islamic religious concepts, Beckford grounded the moral and cosmic terror of Vathek's quest in a meticulously researched setting.
So it's not just generic fire and brimstone.
Not at all. When Vathek descends into the Hall of Eblis, the descriptions are not generic fiery pits, but landscapes detailed with specific cultural markers and architectural forms associated with the medieval Abbasid Caliphate.
So this deliberate fusion, the Oriental tale, blended with the European myth of Faustus, is what makes it a potent example of cultural interanimation.
Exactly. The text is simultaneously deeply rooted in a genuine, researched Oriental vision, while being profoundly European in its thematic structure of ambition and damnation. Beckford achieved a synthesis so complete that the work has been called both very Oriental and very European. It demonstrates that intellectual shape-shifting had matured. It was no longer just a mask for European critique, but a method for achieving a new, hybrid form of literature rooted in deep cultural fusion.
That progression is incredible, from the critical Turk to the philosophical Ethiopian prince, and finally to the ambitious caliph. But the spirit of the foreign observer wasn't limited to the Ottoman world. It expanded dramatically, leading us to transcultural exchange with China.
The shift to China is fascinating because it marks a significant expansion in the cosmopolitan reach of the Enlightenment. It shows that European curiosity was not restricted to the Near East or the Islamic world, but extended to sophisticated, distant civilizations. And this is clearest in Oliver Goldsmith's Citizen of the World from 1762, which features a Chinese philosopher, Lian Shi, residing in London.
Why China? What did using a Chinese observer add to the genre that a Persian or a Turk couldn't?
China represented not just a distant curiosity, but an ancient, stable, and highly organized non-European civilization with a deeply respected ethical and administrative system. Goldsmith's primary goal with Lian Shi was comparison and fostering sympathy toward all men, Chinese and English.
So Lian Shi observes London life through a Confucian lens.
That's right. He observes the follies of London society, the political hypocrisy, the obsession with fashion, the venality of literary patronage, all through this different yet equally established moral framework.
I remember his observations being incredibly specific. Can you give an example of his satire?
Oh, it's wonderfully specific. For instance, he struggles to comprehend the English concept of liberty, noting that while the English boast of freedom, they willingly submit themselves to the tyranny of custom and fashion.
That's sharp.
Or he recounts the chaos around elections where political agents bribe and coerce voters, yet everyone proudly declares themselves free. He also uses the ideals of Chinese beauty, which valued serene composure, to critique the harsh, almost aggressive makeup and high, unstable hairstyles of London women, which he viewed as both ridiculous and precarious.
This demonstrates that Enlightenment writers were already engaging deeply with China, recognizing a legacy of intellectual progress.
They absolutely were. This intellectual openness regarding China reinforces a powerful historical legacy of mutual respect and intellectual exchange between Europe and China, one that existed well before this literary movement. Major Enlightenment figures like Voltaire and Montesquieu were highly aware of the profound ancient Oriental influence on the progress of civilization.
What specifically about Chinese civilization captured their admiration?
Voltaire, in particular, admired China's ethical system. He drew heavily on Jesuit accounts of Confucianism and saw in China a society governed by philosophy and moral virtue rather than by religious dogma or hereditary aristocracy. This ideal system, in the European imagination, had achieved stable order and peace over centuries.
So is this recognition of ancient wisdom sourced from the East?
Absolutely. Whether through the philosophy of Confucius or the administrative structures of the imperial system, it was widely accepted among Enlightenment thinkers.
So they weren't just curious about the literary potential. They saw China as a model for practical governance. Let's connect this to that specific practical application of intellectual merit, the long-standing Chinese system of the hired administrator.
It is a profound historical point. It underscores China's tradition of capable governance built on administrative merit. European observers were fascinated by the longevity and stability of the Chinese empire, and they correctly attributed much of that success to the rejection of feudal rule in favor of a central administrative class.
We often hear that this system was built purely on Confucian ideals, but the source material suggests the implementation was more of a political victory.
That's the key historical nugget. While Confucian ideals certainly informed aspiring officials, teaching them to be learned, virtuous gentlemen, the practical, enduring establishment of the hired administrator system was a political success. It was the victory of talent, or at least standardized administrative competence, over birthright.
And who should we credit for formalizing this revolutionary system?
The true credit for the decisive victory of hired, centrally managed administrators over entrenched hereditary feudal lords goes back to the unifier of China, Qin Shi Huangdi. He wasn't the originator, but he exported and implemented a system pioneered by his minister, Sheng Yang. It was fundamentally a victory of the emperor over local strongmen.
So he replaced localized hereditary power with centrally appointed officials. And what was the long-term imperial benefit of that change?
The system, which was retained and refined by the Han Dynasty and all subsequent dynasties, provided crucial stability for the central imperial power. It prevented officials from building dangerous local power bases.
How did it do that?
Administrators were hired on a basis resembling a modern contractor, and they were often rotated geographically every few years. This ensured they did not become rooted in the regions they governed. Their employment was entirely dependent on the emperor's favor and competence.
So it's a focus on verifiable administrative talent and strict control.
Exactly. And it showcases the efficacy of this system in sustaining imperial rule over millennia, a structure that sharply contrasted with the fragmented feudal systems still dominant in parts of Europe.
It's very clear why Enlightenment thinkers found that system so compelling. The entire tradition, from Mahmud to Lian Qi, shows this incredible adaptability. But now we have to ask, what was the deeper philosophical engine powering this intellectual shapeshifting? It feels like it's more than just a convenient literary trick.
It is. It's fundamentally a question of the writer's identity and philosophical posture, which we can examine through the lens of the persona.
Persona, okay.
Modern literary theory uses powerful metaphors to explain this. Consider the writer as Proteus, the constantly changing Greek sea god who could adopt any form. Or, an even better one, consider the writer as the silkworm.
The silkworm. How does that explain the writer's changing roles?
Well, the silkworm produces the filament, the silk, which is the poetry from its own saliva. The silk, which seems entirely external, is intrinsically tied to the silkworm's inner being. Similarly, the writer's work, even when adopting radically external forms or foreign masks, originates from and is tied to their singular identity.
So it's about unity and variety.
That's the core idea. The writer, despite adopting diverse roles, seeks an unchanging, singular core self that remains unaffected by the external transformations. The movement is constant, but the identity underneath is singular.
So the writer is constantly playing roles, but the purpose is to confirm the solidity of their own core identity.
Precisely. And this necessary movement is central to the very concept of the persona. We have to remember that the Latin root of persona, personare, means to sound through.
To sound through.
The mask is not a static identity, it's an instrument. It resonates, sounding through to interaction and dialogue. The persona is a process, not a noun. It's the writer's act of taking positions, examining radically different worldviews, and engaging in the constant to and fro of argument.
And this dialogue generates depth.
It does, and it allows the intellectual self to escape the limitations of a fixed national identity.
This philosophical move, this willingness to adopt the mask of the other, must have been essential for Enlightenment writers to escape their own subjective cultural biases. It sounds like a path toward a more comprehensive view of reality.
It was absolutely necessary for achieving what we call realist perspectivism. This is the intellectual drive to gain a detached, broad, and encompassing view abstracted from time and space. The foreign observer, whether Uzbek or Lian Qi, functions as a lens.
A lens to see both distant places and different times.
Exactly. It's the only feasible way to escape the parochial constraints of their immediate cultural identity and geographical location.
This quest for a detached, universal view. It reminds me of the ancient philosophers who sought truth through constant change and flux.
That connection is profound and highly relevant. We can trace this intellectual fluidity back to Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher from around 500 BCE, and his famous doctrine of pantarei.
Everything flows.
Everything flows. Heraclitus's cosmology was based on the premise of difference and sameness, the unity of opposites, the classic example being the river.
Right. No man ever steps in the same river twice.
Precisely. The river is constantly changing, yet we call it the same river. This concept celebrates the fluidity of existence and demands that we divide the particular, the individual, transient observation, from the general, the universal pattern.
So the Enlightenment writers were, in a sense, applying Heraclitean flux to social and cultural criticism. They realized that by intentionally changing their perspective, by stepping into the river of the other's mind, they could unlock universal truths about their own world.
It provides the philosophical foundation. And this search for a detached, universal, and interconnected truth extends directly into our modern scientific understanding. We can even connect the 18th century intellectual shift to modern physics by contrasting the methods of Newton and Einstein.
That's a huge leap from Persian letters to quantum mechanics. How does that contrast illuminate this idea of perspectivism?
Well, consider Newton. His groundbreaking discoveries, gravity, the laws of motion, were based on direct, naked-eye observation. His physics described a tactile material world that was easy to confirm with everyday, commonsensical experience. His truth felt singular and absolute.
The empirical truth, based on what we can touch and see.
Contrast that with Albert Einstein. His theories asserted that the movement of thought, the movement of planets, and the movement of the body are all interconnected. His work fundamentally negated the commonsensicality of physics.
Because it's based on things we can't see.
Right. Einstein's model demands considering the invisible hidden processes, asserting that perspective radically alters reality. This provides a profound model for an alliance between the empirical and the spiritual sciences to understand reality's infinite diversity.
So the intellectual shape-shifting of the 18th century, this relentless endeavor of the mind to encompass the world through diverse perspectives, is philosophically aligned with Einstein's view that the observer and the observed are inherently connected. The single, fixed viewpoint is simply inadequate.
Exactly. It captured the enduring human need to synthesize different perspectives to find a truer form of reality. So if we bring this entire deep dive back into focus, the 18th century tradition of the foreign observer and its deep intellectual interest in cultures like the Ottoman Orient and China was not a monolithic discourse of separation. Quite the opposite. It was compelling evidence of vigorous cultural interanimation and sophisticated ideological interaction.
A genuine dialogue.
A genuine dialogue. This historical legacy of mutual respect and transcultural exchange, particularly regarding civilizations like China, remains vital today as we think about global cultural inclusivity and building a truly shared future for mankind. The willingness of European intellectuals to engage deeply with non-Western philosophical and administrative systems demonstrates a historical openness that is often forgotten.
So what we've really discovered is that the willingness to shift perspective from a fixed national viewpoint to a fluid cosmopolitan one was the critical engine of Enlightenment critique. It demonstrated conclusively that intellectual depth and critical insight arise not from a narrow singular focus, but from a broad comparative context. The enduring openness and the willingness to adopt the mask of the other, the intellectual shape-shifting, allowed Europe to engage with the world in a way that celebrated knowledge, virtue, and critical inquiry above any predetermined cultural superiority, providing a profound model for intellectual engagement across cultural boundaries.